I now turn to Professor Ian Manners, who is a professor of political science at the University of Lund. Please, Ian.
Super. Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So I'm realizing I'd be on a panel with two leading experts. I thought I've got to do something different here. So I'm going to give us a slightly broader view on this in 4 steps, but they're not 4 separate points. One step leads to the next. The first is about realizing, borrowing the language of Daniel, that we're looking at an autocracy crisis, and I want to unpack autocracy and crisis. The second is to realize that this isn't just a rule of law crisis. The comments about the Vienna Commission, for instance, I think make absolutely clear that this is a broader crisis of some of the core elements of what constitutes the EU. Now, you can have a single market without them, but it's not the EU, it's the free trade area of Europe. So we need to reflect on that. The third is that it's not just an internal or the external dimension of the internal, it's the internal, it's the accession, and it's the external in one bag. We've not really discussed that, I think, so far, so I want to bring attention to that. And then the final, and this is the big one, in order to understand what this means for the study and thinking about the EU, is we have to take a more holistic perspective on how we read the EU externally. And this is where the normative power arguments come into their importance. So let me just lead you down that trip. And it's all in the booklet, by the way. So you can read along and tick me off as I go. So the EU has an autocracy crisis. Now, I've survived a few European crises so far, and I'm still here, so that's good, apart from Brexit, which is bad. But they're always talked about crises, plural. You know, there was this legitimacy crisis, and then a constitutional crisis, and then what was the next one? I always get confused. Oh yeah, a Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, and then there was the refugee crisis, the migration, refugee crisis, Cecilia, yeah. And then a Brexit crisis, and then COVID crisis, and then Ukraine crisis. And there's a tendency for us to have this, what I would describe as a Groundhog Day approach. It's the same day all over again. It's just the crisis is different, right? You know. Now, there is a risk of taking this approach, and one of the risks is that the EU gets mobilized around emergency procedures, that democracy itself is just shifted aside for this emergency, and we have to use more of a securitization approach, if I can put it that way. But we'll soon be back. You know, we're just going to iron out this crisis, and we'll be back as a fully functioning liberal democracy with human rights, rule of law, and that. The bad news is I think that's untrue. Okay, and I'll get to that in my 4th part. I think we have to read these as connected, if not intricately synergistic, and I'm going to use a word here that has negative rather than positive connotation. Point 2. We tend to look at, let's say, the rule of law crisis with Poland and Hungary, or let's say democracy challenges through elections of nasty far-right parties in insert the name of your favorite member state here, as being somehow disconnected and separate. And that we tend to, let's say, you know, push aside the thing that we're not dealing with, in this case, human rights, because that's foreign affairs, whereas rule of law is general affairs, kind of discrimination. And I see that in the Swedish presidency agenda, this kind of separation in some respects, not always, of these different components. But I think they're the same. And you cannot have rule of law without functioning democracy or human rights. The Council of Europe has a very good way of putting this, and I've stolen this for my contribution, which is the necessity of genuine democracy, genuine human rights, and genuine rule of law. That's not just having elections, having a charter of fundamental rights, or signing up to one, or having a court that's independent. It is the components that make this work progressively for the benefit of the people that are subject to it. And I think the word that's missing, we haven't talked about it so far, we've heard the word solidarity used a few times, is the absolute necessity to achieve equality. That's not just because it's a nicety that's sort of embedded in the treaties or is referred to in discussions by the Council of Europe of genuine democracy, human rights and rule of law. It is because it's the antidote, or one of the antidotes, to the crisis that we face, and it is a singular crisis. Why is it that people think it's okay to ignore the rule of law? That people think it's okay to vote for parties and governments that ignore the rule of law? That people vote in elections in which there's no alternative? And that human rights of women, of sexual minorities, of national minorities, and I don't like using the word national, obviously, because I'm in the west country of Britain and we've got our Avalon independence movement, which is subsumed under the Wessex independence movement, which is part the Western Britain independence movement, which is subsequent to the English independence movement, which is different to the Scottish, Welsh and Cornish independence movement, I'll have you know. Because of the absurdity of nationalism as an organising principle, as a function of democracy. And so I think it's incredibly important to take that step back and realise that we're talking about interconnected challenges, which we cannot address one at a time. Point 3. The EU has an internal, have I got that right? Yes, rule of law crisis within the EU. It's got 2 nasty member states. It's had a few before. One of them left, so that's okay. But, and this is particularly true if you look at the VDEM data, we're not alone, right? The EU is in a Europe consisting of autocracies, rising autocracies, many, some, 2 or more, of which have applied to join the EU. Yeah? So my question about Ukraine and corruption and democracy and rule of law was a leader to that discussion. And the EU is in a region where at least 2 potential past, hopefully, democracies have been suspended from the Council of Europe. And shape that environment significantly. And this is covered in greater detail in the piece. But that's not unimportant. There's a tendency to assume, I think, that, and I said this out loud in public, so I must mean it, that the Hungarian position on Sweden joining NATO, right? Or, the voting principles in the UN are somehow national decisions. No, they're not. They're connected. The challenge that the EU faces in the rule of law crisis and the other crises are interconnected. Just look, for example, at the rounds, 6 rounds within the General Assembly, because we can't come to any agreement within the Security Council of the UN. Only about half of the countries in the world are systematically voting to support the principles of the UN. That's a crisis of which the EU crisis and the EU enlargement crisis and the conflict in Ukraine are a subset of that challenge. But is it the crisis of Western liberal democracy? Not alone. It is a challenge of something that we have grown here in Europe, in the EU, and something that has grown around the world. And I didn't realise this, I have to say, until about June 2015. When I thought, oh, there's going to be a referendum in Britain. This is great. This is going to be so interesting. I'm going to join all the groups online and really monitor this as a political science, because that's what I do. And I did that, but it was too late. Because every far-right group, every neoliberal group, every free trade group, every invested libertarian group in Britain was already well organised and had been since the Scottish independence referendum and the alternate vote referendum. In fact, this had begun with the Citizens United initiative in the US, which basically did away with party-related restrictions on financial support. And it infected the British debate. And yet, the more I read into this, after 23rd of June 2016, a year later, the more I realised that this is a problem across democracy and beyond, which connects together economic libertarianism with far-right reactionary nationalist movements. Now, nobody in this room right now believes me, okay? So you're going to have to go and do your own work and realise that this is present even in Sweden, and certainly it's present in Denmark, okay? In fact, the reason I keep on changing country is I'm fleeing the thought police. Here I am, next stop Finland, here I come, okay? Oh no, it's too late, sorry. Oh, shouldn't have said that, but I did. To get to my conclusion then, we've tended to talk about the rule of law crisis, the democracy crisis, the human rights crisis, are separable from far broader practices, but they are connected. It is not a surprise that rising inequality within states is somehow connected to challenges and demands for greater social justice. But the very groups, organizations, political parties and governments that deny these are, for example, all climate change deniers. Yeah. They are all present in every member state of the EU. They are in the European Parliament. They are shaping a broader debate to which we, sorry ladies and gentlemen, are playing catch up to. We are about 10, perhaps 20 years behind the game. And we've got to understand this broader context if we're to understand how the EU can regain its normative power and influence in global politics. What do I mean when I say normative power? That the EU is good and thus everyone should do what we say because we get to define what passes for normal? No. If you invoke the word normative, you mean a question about what should the EU be doing? If the EU stands for these principles, and we've had Article 2 conversations now, these values that we hold in common, what should the EU do and for whom? It's for us, right? Who's us? Yeah. There's no way we can address equality worldwide and inequality worldwide, or the climate apocalypse that awaits us at the end of this century if we do it for us alone. We have to have a much broader understanding that the rule of law crisis, the democracy crisis, the human rights crisis are connected to these other spheres associated with equality, inequality, social justice, unsustainability, insecurity, and the irresilience of our political systems. So just that small little picture for you to take away. Thank you very much.
A somewhat dystopic final note, but it is also encouragement to do something.